Okay, so I'm going to start with mixing up my colours. I've squirted pea-sized blobs on my palette. I'm just going to use my wash brush and pop in about half a teaspoon of water into each of these. And then I'm going to check my colours before I start. So I've got 4 colours I'm popping water in, and 1 colour I'm leaving water out. Just check your brushes clean. I always start with my yellow, and this is Gamboge yellow. If you haven't got Gamboge yellow, you could use a cadmium yellow. Basically, you want a nice warm yellow for these autumn trees. So there's my Gamboge yellow. Next colour, I'm using an artist quality colour called Transparent Orange. I prefer it because it's transparent. If you haven't got that, you could use Cadmium Orange. That's usually a student quality one. You could make an orange with cadmium red and a yellow. So there's lots of options really. You want a very, very bright orange. There we go. So what I want is for these to be consistent. My next colour is Windsor Red. If you haven't got Windsor Red, Cadmium Red. That will work very nicely. I'm just making sure I've rinsed my brush out really well in between. And then my last colour in the mix is Windsor Blue Red shade, or if you're student quality, it would be Phthalo Blue, it would be Intense Blue. You could even get away with a bit of Prussian Blue. If you wanted to use a cobalt or an ultramarine, that would work as well. And then here I've got a little bit of neat sepia. So my colours are ready to go. I'm using a Saunders Waterford paper. It's a rough paper and it's on a block. This is quite a big block, a 12 by 16 block. So I'm going nice and big. I have got 3 tree trunks drawn out on this side. I want to try to avoid those tree trunks with the water and come over the rest of it. Okay, I've got something here called gum arabic. If I can get the lid off. And what we're going to do is apply some of this to the paper. That's about half a teaspoon to a teaspoon. And I'm going to move it around with my wash brush. So what this is going to do is slow the flow of the paint, and it's also going to enable us to lift out some distant tree trunks later on. Just saves us having to use masking fluid. Just give your wash brush a rinse out after, because it does make it a little bit hard. It's like a new brush again with the gum arabic on. If you haven't got gum arabic, you could go without that. It's just a bit harder to lift out. It just makes it easier to lift out. So I'm coming on first of all with my Gamboge yellow. Always start with your lightest colour first. Round number 10 and a circular motion. Just miss these bigger tree trunks. Just blend a little bit through. We're looking for a nice blend. Bring a little bit down here. It's a nice fun one today. And then I'm coming on with my transparent orange. Again, circular motion. Bring some of this through. I want you to make sure that you're blending those colours through the other colours. You don't want to end up with stripes. You want them to feel blended and random. So I'm just bringing a little bit through. Now I must have hit this with a bit of water, and I'll show you how to rectify that a little bit later on. Right, in with the Winsor Red, nice and vibrant. You'll notice that the flow of the paint isn't as much as it usually is because we've slowed the flow with the gum arabic. Paint through. Start to get those tree trunks appearing. It's a bit trickier to paint circular when you've got tree trunks here. And just blend through at the bottom, blend through a little bit at the top. Trying to just adjust these lines a little bit. Just take a little bit more of the orange, just down towards the bottom. So it's got a bit of a different blend there. Then I want a little bit of the blue. So the blue, I want to touch in places where the yellow is. And I'm looking for a nice varied green. So if it's quite vibrant, which intense blue tends to be, I want you to blend the little bit that's on your brush through. So you're just getting these lovely little bits of colour. Don't try and mix it too much with the orange because it will start to go brown and grey. So you're just going to dab little bits in. If you think it looks too blue, then I want you to pick up a little bit of the yellow and just dab that in. But it will settle really nicely. Take a little bit of the yellow in here. I'm going to do some sponging over later. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is take a little bit of tissue where it's run over. I'm just going to lift it a little bit. So this is just a way of lifting that back out. I don't mind a little bit of colour. It'll give it a sense of shadow. So that's looking nice and vibrant. Okay, so I'm going to dry that one off. Okay, so that's nicely dry now, and you're now going to see the beauty of what the gum arabic does. So we're going to lift out some distant tree trunks, so you can make up where they're going to go. I'll start from this side. This is my round number 10, and I'm going to bring on some water. I'm just going to paint down to where I want them to be, and I'm going to leave it just a few seconds. So paint another. You'll see that it's starting to lift, and this is the beauty of the gum arabic. Try to get different heights, slightly different angles, because that will work to look more natural. We're going to go for different thicknesses as well. I'm just going to do some with the round number 10 first, and then I'll drop down to a round number 6. So I've got a clean piece of kitchen towel. I'm just starting to dab to lift. You might need to go over it twice. It depends how much water you've put on in an area. You can see some areas lifted really easily because I've taken more water on. So I'm just going to bring on more water this time. Just keep re-dipping. It needs the water to agitate the surface of the paint. So I've gone a bit too dry that first time. So I'm coming over a second time. I promise you it does work. I don't want it to lift absolutely everything out, but I want it to lift enough that I can see that there is a tree appearing. This is better. So a bit more water. I'm just dabbing along. Just make sure that you don't end up with really dirty kitchen towel and that you dab more of the paint back on. You can see these tree trunks appearing. So it's a nice way to do distant trees because they look nice and soft, whereas masking fluid or leaving them dry tends to look quite hard. Come back into this one. So you've got a really nice one appearing there as well. Make this a bit bigger. Needs to get thicker towards the bottom on a tree trunk, thinner towards the top. That's better. So if I swap down now, I'm going to pick up around number 6 and do the same thing but create a couple of smaller ones. So if I pop one in here, and then as they get the bigger, they come further forward. As they get smaller, they come further back. So Any I'm putting in that's smaller. Come further back. So you're just concentrating on getting a nice shape and just keep lifting. So I'm going to have one crossing over at the back here. More out of this one. The smaller the bush, the more you're going to have to dip it back in the water so that the paint's coming off. I mean, you could have avoided all of these, but it would have been very, very tricky. I'll do another one up here. Got a lot of light, lovely trees there. So the next stage I'm going to do is a little bit of sponging. So I've got a natural sponge here. I'm wetting it. I'm wringing it out really well. I'm going to dab it off. So all the moisture's coming out of that sponge. And I'm looking for my little bobbly bits. So there's lots of little bobbly bits here. If I pick up a little bit of yellow in there, then we're going to start to come on. And I'm going to avoid the tree trunks. I'm dabbing on with the sponge. I'm going to start to build up. If you go over the tree trunks a little bit, don't worry, because there will be little bits coming over the tree trunks anyway. I'm just going to start to build up some foliage. Take some towards the bottom. So a few dabs of the yellow and go straight into the orange. A few dabs of the orange. Little bits come onto the tree trunks, don't worry. You just don't want to cover all of them. Just try to aim for either side. Still don't need to rinse the sponge out. I'm going to come into the red. Bring the red further down. We can start to bring it over the bottoms of those tree trunks as well. So I'm getting a nice potency at the bottom. Just make sure your sponge isn't too wet. And a little bit coming over actually works really nicely. Sort of ties the trees into the bottom. Don't take too much further up because you don't want it to be too vibrant at that point. I'm going to rinse my sponge out. I'm going to take a tiny bit of that blue into the yellow. So I'm making a green. There's my green. And then I'm just going to bring a bit of that in places as well. Have a little bit in the foreground here, a little bit up in the trees. You can break through the red with a little bit of the green. It's a good natural shadow colour. It'll work to knock that back a little bit. So lots of dabbing. So I'm going to dry that one off. Okay, so that's nicely dry and I'm going to start to work onto the trees now. So I'm going to use around number 10 and around number 6. So around number 10 I'm going to come on with a little bit of water. So if I start from this side, then I'll work my way across and you can see the process. So these are birch trees, so we are going to go fairly dark. I'm using sepia. You could use Payne's grey as well. You could use something like burnt umber. You're really just capturing the dark bits on the trees. So I want you to dot either side of the tree. I don't want you to pop the dark all the way down either side though. I want little dots of it. Some little dots in the centre as well. So I'm looking for random. We're going to tackle it that we'll do the trunks first and then we'll do the branches later. So once you've got it like that, there are several tools you can use. So you can indent with a knitting needle or anything pointy, even the bottom of a brush, sharpened brush, a sharpened twig, all work. You can indent with your little bit of plastic bank card. These little indents will form dark patches while the paint's wet. You can also scrape with the card in an upwards arch. So you're going to start to move the paint. When it's a little bit wet, it's harder to do. It runs back. So you've just got to keep going. That's going to give texture. I'm scraping with the flat of the card. So it's a little piece, it's about 1 centimetre wide. And I'm just scraping in places in an upwards arch. So an arch like that, like a shallow N. And that's just going to give a sense of a circular object. Okay, so I'm going to do a few more. So these ones are all quite little over here. So a little bit of water. We'll whisk through a few of these. You don't have to do that circular motion on every single one. You want them all to be a little bit different. So this is neat sepia, and I've just got a wet brush, dipped it into the neat sepia. So I can just dot it on. So I'm going to go a lot quicker now. I've got a fair few to do. Just dot it around. Make sure you get some towards the bottom as well. You can indent with your knitting needle. Those little dark bits, as it dries, those indents, you'll see them much better. So I'm just pressing on the paper as if I was drawing with a knitting needle. Just popping a few marks on. When the paint's wet and it's going on in the water, what tends to happen is you get that feel of it being cylindrical anyway, and that tends to move around. You can actually pull some little bits out as well. You see that? So when it's particularly wet and you indent, you can scrape out, and they work really wonderfully for bits of branches, but it's got to be wet enough that it can run down. If it's not wet enough, then it won't run. So you can do one that way here. It's basically where it's still very shiny, and it will just run down the indent because it's very fluid still. So that's a really useful tip. So with the flat of the card again, just going to do an upwards arch in places. You don't have to go all the way along the tree. It's just everything's adding to that cylindrical feel. If you scrape and it runs back, it's too wet. If you scrape and it does nothing, it's too dry. Okay, so for these little ones, I'm just going to paint one side. So I'm just going to come along. This is on to dry. Just paint this one side in. Very tiny. So that one side will be enough. This is my round number 6. Then I'm just going to wet next to where that paint is, just so it's got somewhere to flow, and it will give them more of a cylindrical feel. Okay, so we're on to one of the big ones now. So these are nice and white. That gives us an option to put a little bit more detail in. So I'm going to put plenty of water on. I'm going to pick up a bit of sepia. Because these are bigger and I want to indicate the shadow, I'm going to run the sepia down one side. So I'm going to run it down one side, and then I'm going to dot it in places on the other side. So it's just choosing which side you want to be the dark side and which side you want to be the light side. So I can pop this on with round number 10 because it's a bigger tree. Always use the biggest brush you can for the job. So a few dotty bits on there. So with my knitting needle, I can draw in my indents. It's quite nice if you arch some of these on the bigger tree as well. These little archy bits. Then I can pull out, whilst it's still damp, pull out a few little bits, twiggy bits. Pick up my little bit of card. I'm going to start at the top because it's a bit dry up there, and I'm scraping through in an arched motion. And I'm going to do quite a lot of this tree because I want that texture to be there. You can scrape both ways. It's just easier when you're right-handed to scrape this way. When you're left-handed, it's easier to scrape that way. I'm right-handed. Ooh. You could do this with a palette knife as well, but I find the little bits, chopped up bits of plastic cards much easier. Works better. That's got a really nice texture to it. So what I've got now is some FW ink. This is sepia as well. It's an acrylic ink. I'm just going to pop a little bit into my palette. So as these are a bit stronger, because we want them to contrast and they're a bit bigger, we've got options of adding bits of ink. So you can just do it with your knitting needle. The ink's beautiful because it spreads out. It's opaque, so it granulates a little bit on the surface. So you can just pop it in with a knitting needle. If you're lucky enough to have a nib pen, you could pop it in with a nib pen. You could pop it in with a twig, sharpened. You could pop it in with a bamboo skewer. You know, the ones you use in barbecues? I have those for my students. So there's lots of different ways, and this is just giving it a bit more depth and boldness, a bit more contrast in these front trees. And you always get these really dark bits, so it works really nicely. You see those? That's looking really nice and bold. So I'm going to go now on to these next two trees. I'm just working left to right. There's a lot of trees, so it's a lot of tree practice for you. Then I'm going to come in with a bit of the sepia again. And dot that through. All the way through. Then use my knitting needle to indent. Get some nice indents on here. Do some bits coming out. So this is going to give you plenty of tree practice. And then the scraping. Upwards arch. Don't have to do it everywhere on these littler ones. You just want a few bits that indicate the texture. Just try not to put your hand in the ones that are wet. Okay, so I've got these two big ones left now. So I want plenty of water on these again. You can do these one at a time. I'm quite quick, so I'm doing more. you can do them one at a time. I am trying to make sure I get plenty of water on, so I've got plenty of time to do it. So this is the sepia watercolour, and we're going to do that same thing. We're going to come down the same side we did the other one, so that we're getting that nice shadow all the way down one side. You're going to dot little bits in. This is the big one. We're going to dot a little bit more in. Get my knitting needle to indent and start to pop a few indents in. A few barky bits, some texture. Pop a bit more with that sepia ink out. It is acrylic, so you do have to make sure you wash your brushes very well. So I'm going to start scraping here because that bit looks a bit dry. Trying to find the sections that are a bit drier to scrape. Upwards arch. Come back this way here to move that paint. So it's really, really nice and effective. So if I take my round number 6, and then I'm going to start to come on with a little bit of the sepia. And we'll take a bit more in these two because I want these to be nice and dark. You can see it spreading, look, it's beautiful. Spread on those indented bits in places. It's going to make it nice and dark. It's just because it's so wet, it's spreading. It's lovely. This is exactly what you want on these last two. You want less on this one though. You want more on this one at the front, less on the one behind. It's really lovely and effective. What I'm going to do as well is just scrape through some of the ink on this one, so it spreads some of that ink. Then with my dip pen, I'm just coming on, you can do this with your knitting needle as well. I'm just starting to bring out a few branches. Because these are in ink, they'll dry and stay put, which is quite a nice thing. You can dip into your pot of ink as well. Then you'll get longer ones. I'm going to take a few and just start to build up a few darker ones. If you haven't got a dip pen, again, bamboo skewer, knitting needle, a wooden twig sharpened, all works. You can also use a rigger brush. You want just a nice flow. Don't try to do too many at once. You're just going to start to put a few on and we're going to assess later. So I'm not keen on what's happened here because that was still very wet. So I've got options on rectifying that, or I can work with it. So if I take a bit more of this ink and pull through with a rigger, this is going to start to blend some of it out. The other option is to scrape through, so that it blends it a little bit differently. That already looks better. Sometimes it's just knowing about how to correct it. I'm just going to take a little bit of water just in there, because that's just going to stop that looking hard, and a little bit just in there. In fact, I can bring that down for that edge. So what I'm doing now with the rigger is pulling out a few softer branches. So we're just building up. The rigger's a long thin brush, and this is just, I'm applying water directly through the ink. So it's just starting to blend these out. The ink takes a little bit longer to dry, so you've got a bit more time to play with it. It's really nice and effective. Just keep pulling out branches. This one's a bit dark, so I'm just blending through a little bit of water. I'm sure I'll have some darker ones later anyway. It's just starting to build that up. So I'm going to dry that off now. Okay, so that's nicely dry now. I'm going to look to build up a little bit more texture. What I've got here is a soft hog hair brush, and I've just picked up some of the orange paint, and I just want to stipple in places. So I'm not doing this all over. I'm just picking out areas so that I start to create a bit more depth within the foliage at the back. You've also got a little bit more control with a stippling brush. You can use very cheap paintbrushes. Kids' paintbrushes work very well, oil painting brushes, for stippling. So you don't actually need it to actually be an oil painting brush. A kid's paintbrush will work quite nicely. The more splayed out it is, the better. So I'm just creating patches of foliage. So it's just giving a bit more variety and a bit more depth in that background. You want the paint to be quite dry, but not too dry. a flat palette works very well for sponging and for stippling, because you don't want to pull up too much paint into the brush. Again, it becomes too wet. So here we've got little highlights on the sides of the tree trunks, and that's working really nicely with the extra bit of orange. Those little highlights start to show a bit more. Basically where I've missed the paint. It's a happy accident that's working very nicely, so we're going with it. And dip a little bit into some of the red as well, just down this side. I want this to be nice and bold down here. This is just helping bold it up in this corner. Bring a little bit over the tree, over the bottom of this tree as well. Giving additional boldness in there. Just give that a rinse out. I've got a little bit of the green left. It's not quite as thick, but I wouldn't mind just knocking back some of the colour. The red and green are complementary colours, so it knocks back the colour quite well. Just behind these ones in the distance. Just a little bit. So I'm just randomly dabbing on just to break through that a little bit. Could also use a little bit of sepia, that would work. Just about knocking that colour back a little bit down this way, so that it's not quite as bold. Bold here, leading my eye this way. So this is a bit of the sepia. Just towards the bottom of those trees. Okay, so I've got my rigger brush now. I've got this sepia here. I've still got the sepia ink. I want to get a few branches through these other bits. So what I want you to think about is where trees might be in front of other trees, so that you don't just overlap them all. Some might come back, some might come across. This one's definitely a more forward one, so we'll have some branches coming this way and over. Branches alternated up the trunk. The more trees you've got, the more branches you'll have. And just come out, alternate on the other side. Overlapping in places. If it looks like it's been stuck on, you're just going to dab it with a little bit of water at the bottom. Then it will just blend in to that trunk. Just dab the end. Vary the direction of a few as well, so they don't all go the same way. less is more. Less branches will work better than loads and loads. I'm going to show you another couple of tricks in a minute. For easy branches. So I rest on my little finger when I'm doing this. So I'm going to use a little bit of the sepia ink now on this one. Just pull out a few, because this is one of the ones that I want to be more bold. So I'm going from them dark patches and pulling outwards, crossing over those two distant trees. Some nice fine branches. It's really good practice. The same applies with, if it just doesn't quite look like it's connected to the tree, just dab a little bit of water at the very bottom and it will connect. Will work quite nicely. So these are now building up really nicely. Okay, I'm going to dry that one off. Okay, so that's nicely dry. What I've got now is a Faber-Castell permanent sepia pen in a fine. It's a drawing pen. It's got a Pitt Artist pen. It's dark sepia. It's a permanent pen, so it's always useful to have a permanent pen in your kit for things like fine branches. It gives you an option of popping these fine branches in without hardly any effort. You can go super fine and you're totally in control. So that's a fabulous tip, to have one of these in your kit. You can extend bits up, you can extend bigger branches, you can just pop finer branches in. Again, less is more with this. Don't go mad, but it's adding a different fineness. And we are going mixed media today, so it's all okay. And these will just stay put because they're permanent pen. Try to make them not too straight. Wiggle the pen a little bit so you don't end up with really straight branches, because they're not really straight in nature. And make sure you're crossing over some of these tree trunks. You want things to cross. You can get all sorts of thicknesses in these pens, but I tend to just prefer to have a fine and work with that. Steep is a good colour to have because it doesn't dull the colour of your work. Black tends to be a bit harsh at points, especially with watercolour. Not so bad if you're using ink as well. Remember, so you want some in different directions. So it's all starting to gel together nicely now. Varying where they're coming off the chunks. I've got one lower, one higher. One lower, one higher. Crossing over another tree. One going up, one coming down. It's all about variety. building up a really nice mesh of branches here. A few lower down always works quite nicely as well. Okay, I think I'm about there. So what we're going to do now is a little bit of a play, just to start to brighten this up in the foreground. So I have got here some pearlescent inks. They're FW inks again. This one is hot yellow. So I'm going to pop a bit of that in my palette. You always make sure you shake it up well, especially the pearlescence. I should have done this first because it sticks at the bottom, and you always have to make sure that the pipette empties out because it's they tend to get a bit stuck. So that's hot yellow, and this one is bird wing copper. So again, a good shake. So we're going to take some of these colours in. So I've popped it on my palette because it's easier to apply doing it like that. So if I take my round number 10, and I've got just a standard palette knife, I'm going to start with the yellow. I'm just going to paint some of it on, and we're going to splatter. We could sponge. Splattering tends to have a more natural effect, and I quite like it. So you take your finger, turn it over where you've applied the paint, take it close to your work, splatter. Now the acrylic ink is opaque. This is opaque and pearlescent, so we've got two winds here. So it's going to cover bits of the tree trunk, and I just want you to take your time and apply this. If you didn't have acrylic ink, you could use a little bit of gouache. You could just sponge on more watercolour. This just gives a lovely natural feel, and it's quite fun as well. Just got to remember to do it the right way so you don't splatter yourself. Keep it close to your work. I mean, it's splattered down here, but it's not splattered anywhere too high on the painting. So I'm just trying really to hit the bottom of the trees because that's going to lighten that area up. So we'll take a bit of the copper colour in now. So that's looking really nice. You do get a bit messy. Just dip my fingers in there. So if I take some of this orange paint and take it into that yellow watercolour, not watercolour, ink, I'm going to get a nice vibrant orange as well. So this is something they don't tell you, but you can mix them and get fairly opaque colours. I always say if you're going to buy one colour, buy a pearlescent white and a sepia, because they're the ones that I absolutely love, and then add watercolour to them to make the other colours. So you can get quite a lot of colours of ink by adding watercolour to white pearlescent. So this is making a much nicer vibrant orange, because I want a bit of vibrant orange in here. The copper's nice, but it's very muted. So there's always ways and means to fix things. Okay, just dip that in there, rub off my finger. So with a water spritzer, I want to spread some of this now whilst it's still wet. I'm going to be very careful because it's at risk of lifting the gum arabic as well. So whatever I do now, I've got to dry it really well. What this does is just help it spread. You'll see it start to glisten. And start to move. If you want to, you can bring through a few brambly bits. This is with the knitting needle, and I'm just indenting the paper where it's wet. So I've sprayed this bottom section, really. I'm just starting to play with the ink. So that copper looks more like gold against the brightness of the yellow and the orange, but it's working really, really nicely. I'm really pleased with this. If you scrape upwards, you'll get brambly bits coming that way as well. Okay, I'm going to dry that really well. Okay, so that's dried really well, and now I'm going to take some of the blue into that yellow again. So this is that yellow ink with a bit of blue paint to make the green. So we're just building up. Drying it off just means that you're in control. You don't want it to be all mixing too much together. I want some of this lower. This bottom section. It's working really nicely. Just rinse that off. Just going to take a few dabs just in towards this bottom section as well. It's quite hard to hit the edge of the page, and I want a few in here at the bottom to brighten up. Then I've also got the sepia ink, so I'm going to take a few dabs on with that. I'm thinking undergrowth. Not too wet, just want a tiny bit of sepia. Dip it in a little bit. can use a knife, palette knife, just to scrape up a little bit with the sepia. I'm going to spread this in a minute. What you wanted is like a blended effect. Then we get a bit more of this green on to bring through. Got a little bit of it left. Just get a good rodge of the green on. I don't want it to be too blobby, so I'm just eliminating that a little bit. And actually, before I go any further, I'm going to do a few more branches. I'm going to show you how to blend those, so you can do them with your dip pen. I want a few fine ones. You can do it with your knitting needle, you can do it with your rigger. So some of this now I'm pulling through is got some of the green in, some of the sepia, but the other two colours we did earlier were dry, so that's not blending through those, which is exactly what I want. I don't want it to blend through everything. So these are giving us some lovely depth in the foreground around this bottom of this tree. And then we're going to spritz, because we want some of this to blend out and soften in. So I'm spritzing quite a lot because I want the ink to move. So it's moving quite a lot here, it's not moving here. So to make it move, you just agitate it a little bit with the brush. So we're building up layers of the ink in the foreground. And that's starting to give us a bit of boldness. Okay, I'll dry that one off. Okay, so this is dry now, and I'm just going to pop in a few little bits of this copper just to bramble through and break up the dark. So this is the birdwing copper, and I'm breaking through with my nib pen, but you could use a knitting needle, you could use a bamboo skewer. And it's just going to give it a little bit of light. It's all about building the layers up, the light and the dark. We've done the light layers, then we've done the dark layers. Now I'm just breaking this up a little bit with a few bits of light. And these will shimmer as they dry, which will be a really nice effect in the foreground. It's the beauty of using mixed media, is you get to do these little bits. Just breaking through with just brambly bits really. Okay, I'll dry that off. So there we go, all finished. I hope you've enjoyed it. There's lots of lovely texture in there, lots of lovely techniques for you to have a go at as well. I'll pop a video this side if you've liked this one and you want to do another one. I'll pop you one over here for you to have a go at, and I'll see you next time.